Alright, guys, we are now in chapter 4, Discovery and Shame. I called my folks from college in Madison to tell them I was pregnant, and my dad said, "Don't come home." And my mom would not buck my dad. At the time, my dad was a sheriff. He would be up for re-election, and he did not want a daughter like me around. It was fine while I was class valedictorian and the shining star, but not when I was pregnant. No, glory. For single girls who became pregnant during these decades, the most common solution was a hasty trip to the altar and claim that baby's birth was premature. One reason that the high number of pregnancies wasn't socially acknowledged was that so many premarital conceptions were effectively covered up through marriage. On average, 50% of these young women were married before the baby was born, leaving only half to be recorded as illegitimate births. Since the average age of marriage had dropped after the war, it was not all unusual for young people to get married in their late teens and very early 20s. Throughout the war years and until about 1972, the median age at first marriage for women remained below 21. Those who did not plan to attend college often got married shortly after graduating from high school. You could always get married to give the baby a name, then get divorced afterward. That was what was done. That's what many girls did. Maureen, too. For many girls, however, marriage wasn't an option, and the reasons varied. In some cases, the young men walked or ran away from the pregnant partners. Many simply weren't ready for marriage. In other cases, the young couple wanted to get married, but parents or clergy discouraged or prevented their plans from moving forward. Those who were not yet of legal age, which could range from 14 to 21, depending on their state of residence, needed their parents' permission to marry. When I told him I was pregnant, he asked me what the heck I thought he should do. And the next thing I knew, he was gone. I was devastated when he just hit the road. I felt so violated, so stupid, so used. I never told anyone. I couldn't even get it out of my mouth, because to say I was pregnant might have made it real. I don't know whether I thought an angel would appear and tell me what to do, or better yet, maybe a truck would run me over. I just thank God that 1967 was the era of big tent dresses. I never heard from him again, except for when I had the baby. I wrote him a note, and he called me and said, "You sound so bitter, Lynn." You were never bitter. This was Lynn's story. I had been dating the father of the baby for probably a year and a half or 2 years. He was in Vietnam, and he came home to Minnesota on leave, and that's when we started up a more serious relationship. I got pregnant when he came home for good. In the beginning, I sort of fantasized that we would get married. I remember looking through the Sears catalogs on curtains and kitchen tables and things like that. Then it became clear that he didn't want to get married. So that was that. Susan 1. I was 17 when I found out I was pregnant, and I was actually not too worried because I had gone out with my boyfriend for 4 years, and we had talked about getting married. I was graduating from high school in a few months, and I had gotten a job. My boyfriend had gone into the National Guard because his draft number was something like 3. I called him and told him that I was pregnant. He didn't say anything. I was just so sure that everything was going to be fine. A week later, he came home, but he was still evading it. Then he said, "I'm not ready for this. I'm not ready for this." I thought, well, he just needs time. In the meantime, he moved into his own apartment with a couple of his buddies, and he still wasn't talking about what we were going to do. I was just hoping that he was going to call and say that he cared about me, about our baby. But at that point, I didn't really care if he loved me. I just wanted some way to be able to keep the baby. Kathy 1. I grew up in St. Mark's Parish, and later we moved to St. Anne's. Everything in parishes in Dorchester, if you're familiar with Boston at all, they don't ask where you're from in Boston. It's from what parish. My boyfriend came from a similar background. We met in the fall of 1967 at UMass in Boston. He was my first real boyfriend. We were inseparable. We had been together all summer and didn't have sexual relations that whole year until December. I suspected immediately because I had never been late in my life. When I told him, he cried. He said, "It's not happening. It's got to be something else." But he said he would stand by me and we would get married. You have to go through this pre-Cana stuff with the Catholic Church, and they have to talk to you for a few weeks on end. So we made our first appointments with the priest. I remember him being very suspicious. The next time we went back together, the priest wanted to see my boyfriend by himself. He talked to him for about half an hour, and the next day the priest called my father and said, "There's not going to be a wedding. This boy isn't ready for marriage." Then my boyfriend told me about this church for people who are outcast Catholics, or if you're divorced or some kind of sinner, you can go there. There was a long corridor with little counseling rooms, and my boyfriend went in and talked to the priest, and then he came out and said he wants to see you now. He wasn't like my parish priest. He wore a black robe and white collar. He was a Franciscan. He had a brown robe and sandals, a real rope belt, and I think he had a big crucifix and beads hanging around his waist too. I was little bit fascinated by the look of him. He immediately pointed out to the corridor and said that he was worried about my boyfriend. He started talking about my boyfriend's mother and about him being her only son, and making me feel like this was all about him. He said he was sure that my boyfriend was a good boy and had strong feelings for me, but I was doing the wrong thing by trying to arrange a marriage. He said, "You must know your 12 years of Catholic education that you need to take responsibility for yourself." Diane 1. It was not always parents or boyfriends who were against marriage as a solution to the dilemma. Some young women were determined not to marry despite pressure to do so. Mothers can tell something's wrong by the look of your face. Mine said, "What's wrong?" "Nothing." She called me into bedroom. "What's wrong?" I said, "I'm pregnant." She said, "You're the only one in the family who's ever gotten pregnant out of wedlock," which was a lie. My mother made me feel like a bag of shame. She wanted me to marry him. She said, "Marry him. Marry him. Get us out of this mess." But I didn't want to marry him. My father said, "Get out of the house. I want you out of this house." So my mother bought a Greyhound bus ticket so I could go to my grandparents in Brooklyn. They're from the old Yiddish world, from Poland. I was their first grandchild, and my grandmother loved me very much, but she could not look at me. My boyfriend sent me a ticket to come back. He picked me up and had arranged for a justice of the peace to marry us. I was in high school, and I'm thinking, this is not the way I pictured my life. I mean, I was supposed to go off to college and do better than this. I think he was working in a snack shop. I remember thinking, this is supposed to be the happiest day of my life, and I feel trapped. Then there was a knock at my boyfriend's door, and it was my father and mother. My father said, "Cheryl, I don't want you to rush into this. If you still want to marry him in a year, yes, but don't do it now." I thought, "Daddy, just get me out of here." I don't remember exactly what happened in the next few days or weeks, but my mother kept saying, "Are you sure you don't want to marry him? That's what women do." Cheryl. I had this idea that I couldn't tell anyone. I thought I would be arrested, or they would contact my boyfriend's family, and I would be forced to marry him. I didn't want to marry him. I didn't know if I ever wanted to marry anyone. I had not seen that marriage had done much for my mother, Tony. I graduated and I was going with this guy. My mother and father knew his whole family, and everybody thought he was Mr. Wonderful. He's the one who got me pregnant, but he had slapped me and he didn't want to be with him, and I didn't want to be with him if he could be that mean. I told him the baby wasn't his. I knew that my mother would make me marry him and his family would make him marry me, and I didn't want that kind of marriage. Bonnie. Although the discovery of a daughter's pregnancy was shock for every family, for the women who were not going to get married, the ordeal was all the more traumatic. These young women were made to suffer a latter-day version of social shunning. Once private sexual behavior was made visible and public by pregnancy, it could not be denied. So this still happens, not to the extent, but definitely through, like especially with online presence, and pictures, there's still a lot of shame for many, but there's also a lot of sexual lust. So it's like if a woman posts a picture in, say, revealing clothing, right? She often gets blamed if she was assaulted or molested or raped, but yet these men are never held accountable for doing their actions, or they're not held accountable for their some of the disgusting comments, right? It's always the blame on the woman, not as if they couldn't, not have sex or be held accountable, for part of it, or take responsibility, for the baby, all this. It's always, let's just keep the young men, available. The shame is always on the woman, and it's really sad. Anyway, continuing on. Given the social stigma of unwed pregnancy at the time, members of the community who wanted to be perceived as maintaining a higher moral standard had to refrain from associating with a pregnant girl. Accepting her condition or helping her keep her child might be perceived as condoning her actions. Most members of society felt they must distance themselves in order to make their position clear. In one of the strictest forms of banishment, high schools and most colleges required a pregnant girl to withdraw immediately. It was not until Title IX of the Education of Amendments Act of 1972 that federally funded high schools and colleges by law could not expel a pregnant girl or teenage mother. So I just want to pause there. Unfortunately, especially with more Christian Catholic schools, for example, BYU, which is Brigham Young University, they do actually expel and they shun pregnant young women if they're not married. And I think even if they are married, at a if they're pregnant at a young age. So, and there are stories to back me up. I'm just saying. So even though this act is available, it still happens, although not as commonly, but it still happens. Now, there are schools or high schools, I should say, that have support. So, for example, in the school that my mom had previously worked in, they actually had a child center to help young parents so that they could then go to classes. And some colleges do, it's more common with colleges now that do this too, where if you're a young parent, there's help. And I think that's just a wonderful thing to help with education. But anyway, we're going to continue on. I got called down to the office at school, and the principal said, "There's a lot of gossip about you being pregnant. We figured that you're about 3 to 4 months, and you may not return to school until you have a doctor's note saying that you're not pregnant." The gym teacher helped me clean out of my locker and drove me home. And the school called my mother and told her at work. I had been this girl who didn't smoke, didn't drink, and didn't do anything wrong. I took care of my kids' brothers and sisters, and everybody's parents wanted their daughters to be with me. What? Now, when I walked down the street, all the parents made their daughters cross the street. They couldn't walk on the same side of the street as me. A sense of shame and humiliation permeated the entire family. Margaret. For every woman I interviewed, even those whose parents showed them a great deal of compassion, the news of their daughters' pregnancies was a wrenching shock. Many girls' parents were overtly disgusted or infuriated with them. But perhaps even more disturbing, many would discussed the situation with their daughters. Some families made their daughters hide in the house so their pregnancy wouldn't be seen, drawing the drapes and making them duck down when they were in the car. The girls were made to feel that they had shamed, if not ruined, the entire family. I called my dad and I said, "I'm pregnant." And he said, "Oh no." We lived about an hour and 10 minutes from my college, and he came to get me. I remember vividly that we did not say one word to each other the entire trip. Not one single word to each other. A block from home, he said, "We still love you." And the minute he opened his mouth, I started bawling. I went in the house and my mother was nowhere to be found. I just sort of wandered around and put my stuff away. And I remember going upstairs and walking in her bedroom, and she was ironing with her back to me. The TV was on, so I sat on the bed and chit-chatted a little bit. But she wouldn't turn around. She just ironed away. Finally, she turned to look at me, and her lip and her chin were kind of quivering, and she said, "I don't know how this happened. We took you to church." I just looked at her and said, "I wasn't thinking about church." I'm sorry, that's a great line. Yeah, who would be thinking about church in that moment? Linda 3. My mom took me to her OBGYN. After the exam, the doctor said, "Do you want to tell your mother or do you want me to?" About 30 minutes later, my mother came out. She was teary-eyed and said, "We'll get through this. We'll talk to your daddy." I was crying and hysterical, thinking, "Oh my God, what am I going to do? I've just ruined my whole family." My dad came home at 5:30, and I guess my mother told him. He came in and he had tears in his eyes, and this is very hard for me to talk about because it still hurts. He said, "We're going to take care of this. You don't have to worry about a thing." My dad had been commuting back and forth from Fort Worth to Dallas, and he made this decision that this would be a good time for us to move to Dallas so that nobody would know. During the time I was at the maternity home, my mother would come and take me to Dallas to see the new house they had moved to while I was gone. When we got to the neighborhood, I would have to get down on the car seat and hide. Mother would come down the alley and open the garage, pull the car into the garage, close the door, and then I could get up. All the curtains would be closed in the house so nobody could see me. My sister and brother were told that I was staying in Fort Worth to finish schooling, and everybody in Fort Worth thought I was in Dallas. Nancy too. The couple times I did go to my parents somewhere, I had to lie down in the back seat. We had a 3-car garage, and my father would take the car from where it was parked on the left-hand side. He would back it up to the porch, and I would go right down the stairs and get in the back seat of the car. I had to lie down until we got out of the neighborhood because my parents didn't want anyone to know I was home. I couldn't answer the door. I couldn't answer the phone. It was all, what are the neighbors going to think? Kathy, too. We had lived in a typical Michigan 2-story home with a basement. I got to go downstairs on the main level with my mom during the day and eat dinner with my father and mother. But if a neighbor came or any company, I had to go upstairs and stay out of sight. We lived in an old house with wood floors, and they creaked, so I couldn't move. I had to go upstairs and be still. I spent most of my pregnancy upstairs. One day, the little neighbor lady next door came over unexpectedly, and I was downstairs, and I couldn't get upstairs soon enough. So I was hiding in the downstairs bathroom for 2 hours waiting for her to leave while she visited with my mother, Barbara. Meanwhile, the young men who had fathered these children largely escaped social condemnation. They were not expelled from school, and they were generally not treated with scorn, not stigmatized, and not considered a disgrace to their families. And by the way, they still often aren't. While we can often call some dads or some fathers, deadbeats because they don't, help with the children or pay, child support or whatever, there's still not a lot of stigma behind it. They're still widely accepted into society. They can often get away with not being around the child because unless they tell someone or someone like knows that he personally did this, they could always say, well, that's not my kid, she cheated, or whatever the excuse is. So there's still not enough social stigma for them to take responsibility, but yet single mothers who are even doing what's best for the child, as in raising them, doing everything, are still stigmatized in that aspect. So it's still very much a double standard here. Anyway, where was I? Most parents supported the double standard by holding their daughters, but not their sons, accountable. The school administrators reinforced the notion by allowing the young men to proceed as if they were not involved. Their role in the pregnancy wasn't publicly visible. Thus, they were not publicly condemned. Tens of thousands of girls were asked to drop out of sight, while their sexual partners, who had been so eager to couple escape recrimination, some of these young men did, however, suffer emotional consequences. Several of the women I interviewed relate stories about how their boyfriends' lives had been adversely affected by their pregnancy and breakup. Last summer, I heard from my son's father, and he had a terrible life spiraling downward from this experience. He ended up cutting himself off from his entire family. He felt like he was a screw-up and couldn't do anything right. He ended up in Vietnam, and he was one of those people who were adversely affected by it. That set the tone for his whole life. Lorinda. I lived in a small town in North Dakota. I was just about to turn 17, and my boyfriend was 19 and a freshman in college. We had been dating for about a year and talking about getting married after we both finished school. Then we realized that I was pregnant, and we decided we'd just get married right then. He went out and bought an engagement ring and a wedding ring for me, but our parents wouldn't sign the necessary papers to allow us to marry. He said he went through 2 years of pure hell. He started drinking very heavily and did things during those 2 years that he wouldn't even talk about. He went through a period of extreme rage. He would not accept money from his parents or go visit them because he was so angry. He said at the time I was his whole life, and that had been taken from him. He didn't know how he was going on. Connie 3. The insidious nature of the double standard, which continues today, has been apparent in the studies that try to determine why teens become pregnant. Many studies over the years have tried to identify the predicators of teen pregnancy, and most have looked for answers in the young woman's psyche or personal circumstances rather than looking equally or both parties responsible for conception. Studies have examined such factors such as the young woman's psychology, her economic conditions, her age at first menses, her relationship to her parents, her religion or her lack thereof, her education aspirations, her history of sexual abuse, her love for her partner, and her use or non-use of birth control. And though these indicators offer insight, they're only half the picture. Little attention has been directed toward the young men who are equally responsible. Few have speculated that a young man impregnating a girl is a sign of his neurosis and his low self-esteem, his need for affection or attention, or a sign of his need to improve his virility. In fact, several of the young men implicated in these stories impregnated more than one girl, who was subsequently sent away. Of course, because double standard, right? When I had been divorced from my second husband for a couple years, I contacted my daughter's birth father. I was feeling strong. I am a woman, hear me roar. I was out in the working world again. I was making money. I was supporting my family. I was taking care of business, and damn it, I was going to take care of that too. I looked him up and I called his house. I pretended I was J.C. Penney's and that I needed to speak with him. I got him on the phone and I said, "This is Barb, and I've got some questions to ask you. I want to talk to you. When can you meet up with me? This is embarrassing now. This is the first time I'd seen him in all those years. I said, we have a daughter together somewhere out there, and you never acknowledged it. You walked away. You never talked to me again. You left me. Why? Well, it turns out he had 2 other women pregnant at the same time. One was a girl I used to go to brownies with when I was a little girl. The other was married to somebody else. The girl I had been in brownies was further along than I was, so he married her. The babies were about 3 months apart. He was a 19-year-old boy with 3 pregnant girlfriends. Barbara. The standards of the day dictated that a young woman was responsible for stopping the advances of a young man. Thus, she was ultimately responsible both for his behavior and for her pregnancy if it occurred. It was her own fault if she got pregnant. And this stigma still happens. Like, this is so disgusting that we're talking about, the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and here we are, 60 plus years later, and this is still happening. Our society just sucks, Anyway, let's continue on. Occasionally, the young man's family took the blame a step further, suggesting that the girl was trying to trap their son. Perhaps their son wasn't even the responsible party. In fact, before the 1970s, the most reliable blood tests available could not absolutely prove paternity. The best they could do was eliminate 40% of the male population from being the father based on blood type. Tests developed in the 1970s would include about 80% of men. It was not until the 1980s that DNA could determine a 99.9% likelihood of paternity. Since there was no way to prove fatherhood with absolute certainty in the 1950s and 60s, if a man denied fatherhood, his proclamation often went unchallenged. But very few boyfriends of the women I interviewed denied their role in their pregnancy. Since most of the young women's families wanted to keep their daughter's pregnancy a secret and did not want her to keep her child, proof of fatherhood was not a primary concern. They tried to settle the matter with as little fuss as possible. If the young man's family was involved at all, they often offered to pay some sort of maternity home expense and considered that the end of their involvement and their son's responsibility. My boyfriend talked to his parents, and then he came over to our house. They wanted me to see their doctor because they thought maybe I really wasn't pregnant. Maybe I was just trying to get him to marry me. He went home, and his parents took him back to the University of Florida that night. He called me sobbing and saying, "My parents won't let me get married." His father called my mother and said, "I just want you to know that if there's anything we can do to help or you need any money, we will be glad to give it to you. Leslie." Whether the young women's parents were compassionate or enraged, nearly all the women I interviewed reported feeling ashamed, not so much for being sexual, but for bringing shame upon their families. Many felt that they would do anything their parents wished in order to get back their good graces. Okay, pausing there, adoptees also feel like this. Oftentimes, we feel like we want to please our adoptive parents and have this role, but at the same time, we feel this for our biological parents. And that's not even adding in the pregnancy part. So, yeah, you can see where we're going with this, right? All right, anyway, we're almost done with this chapter. I think my biggest fear was to be ostracized from everything that I had known up to that day, and from my family. I was a 16-year-old high school student. I'd never had to think about anything beyond that. So what I was facing was a look on their faces and just that fall from grace in my neighborhood and in my community and with my family. Not with my friends. I had several other friends who were also pregnant. I mean, it was a thing. This was happening. We accepted that it was going to be in the hands of our parents. It was not something that we were going to be able to say. Here's what we want to do. Lydia. The treatment young women received from family, friends, professionals, and members of their community deepened their sense of abandonment and often contributed to lifelong struggles with low self-esteem. Those who were still dependent on their parents were cast out of their communities or sequestered in their parents' homes. Many dreaded re-entry into their schools and towns because they were unsure about who knew the truth of their experiences. They were asked by families and professionals to lie to everyone about where they had been to keep this charade indefinitely. Most of the women I interviewed have carried with them the rest of their lives the emotional pain of being ostracized and having to live a lie, pretending to be someone they are not. Okay, pausing right there. Okay, sorry guys, my phone is on its last legs right now before I need to go charge. So pausing right there, that's exactly how adoptees feel. We feel this abandonment. We feel this being ostracized, like we're not good enough. We're living a lie. We can't be authentic to our identity. There's so much, and there's so much in relationship to how birth parents are treated. And that's not to say that it's their fault. It's just that's kind of how it is, even in the best circumstances, right? So let's just be real that trauma happens and we need to acknowledge that and work through it. All right. Yet, they were soon to learn that the shame they felt as a result of their banishment would prove to be only the tip of the iceberg. They had yet to learn about the emotional impact of relinquishing their child, a child who was not yet real to them. All right, that is the end of the chapter. I hope you guys tune in on Friday for part 1. It will be Marge's story.